Salesforce Architect is a role that many Salesforce professionals aspire to. It requires thinking broader about system architecture and also experience to make the right decisions and trade-offs. How can these responsibilities be packaged in a way that can describe an architect's role in a given project? Unlike other roles, once you become an architect, the career path is not linear, but instead becomes an arena you can move around within. I wanted to get more familiar with who architects are, which is why I was keen to speak to someone with the answers. Gemma, who's CEO and Solution Architect at the Architect Club, who is best known for founding Ladies Be Architects. So recently we posted an article in Salesforce Ben that was about the 5 different types of architects. I heard from some people that your phone blew up with lots of conversation, so it was a good conversation, I hope.
Yeah, it was actually, yeah, quite a few interesting points of debate, and that was the whole point of it, to inspire that level of debate and conversation about where we fit into projects, how we add value, and what the career path looks like.
Definitely. So what kinds of people were talking, you know, what kind of backgrounds do they come from, and why do you think the article caught their attention?
A lot of people talk about being pigeonholed, and it wasn't the intent to pigeonhole people, and nobody's come forth and criticized that in any way. It was a fantastic take on that, because I think before you tend to look at solution architects, technical architects, sometimes it's not very clear what the differences are, but then there's all this other stuff around it that sometimes gets neglected: the business transformation side, the change and people side, what are the approaches to building a backlog, all of the things that as consultancies we tend to hire in business analysts for, or as Salesforce clients we will tend to bring in people from our technology departments in to advise us on those things. But it is an architectural consideration, because when you start looking at complex implementations, the moving parts aren't just in the technology, they're in the business process, they're in 5 teams that touch one process, and all of those teams need to make individual decisions that will roll up into one big strategic decision. So being able to approach people in the same way that you would approaching a Salesforce implementation in that architectural sense is all the more important as these complex projects emerge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that the article did highlight was the overlapping responsibilities that these 5 types of architects have. So why are so many architects required on a single project?
Well, that's interesting as well, because I don't think that you would need all 5 of these. And also, I don't think that it's necessarily limited to 5. These are 5 that we have spotted based on trends that we've observed in the consultancy space. So, you know, there are multiple flavors. I see them as sets of responsibilities. And I myself have been assigned to projects as both a solution architect and briefly as a data architect. And also as a change management expert, right? Nobody's got a name for the change management stuff. They get bundled away into, oh, this is our learning and people stuff, and it's the first thing that gets chopped off the statement of work in terms of effort when people want to get their project quotes down. But we see it as just as fundamental. In terms of these 5 types, I mean, I don't think you necessarily need all of them on one project. It very much depends on what you're implementing. Is it multi-cloud? Is it multi-platform? Is there any innovation? Are you building your own app that is perhaps going to be on top of the Salesforce platform, whether it's sold externally or not? These are all big decisions and big considerations that need certain skill sets to really optimize, though, to really make sure those decisions are informed and optimized to the best of their ability. And if you went to a technical architect and said, what's the best way for me to communicate this change to all of my salespeople, you might be met with a blank look. Not necessarily, but you might be in some situations, because it is a different focus and a different skill set. So what it's trying to do with these 5 types is effectively say to the ecosystem, absolutely, there is a career path for you, regardless of what your shtick is. If you like building solutions and coordinating them across Pardot and Salesforce, for example, maybe solution architecture is your thing. If you like to advise and design how data is flying in and out of a system and between multiple systems, in what sequence, and what transformations need to be done, then maybe integration is your thing. So, but these are typically responsibilities that are bundled up into roles, because ultimately our customers want to know, when they buy consultancy services or when they're hiring in consultant or hiring in talent, they want to know what bucket to put them in initially, so that they can budget for it, so that they can understand where that role is going to fit in the organization. So whilst none of us, those of us who are generalists don't like being pigeonholed, it's actually a necessary thing that we end up having to have if we hope to transact business in the Salesforce ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. I guess setting the right expectations for what you're expected of as an architect as well, putting some sort of boundaries in there, without being pigeonholed, as you said. And you mentioned that these 5 types were put together based on trends that you saw. Was it always the case that there were these 5 types of architects, or would you say there was a turning point in how the architect role has expanded or bucketed into these definitions?
I think there has been a turning point. The investment from Salesforce in the architecture program is significant, because it's made amazing steps forward into defining what are the various, what is the value of an architect, and how are they different from a system admin, a sales cloud consultant. And all that Salesforce has much more to go on, but the main benchmark they have to go on is certifications, right? But certainly for me, growing up in the Salesforce ecosystem which actually, yeah, I think I have done, architects, when I first started in 2008, were specialists, IT focused specialist roles. And they were brought in when things got tough, when there were multiple facets and things were a bit harder. So I think that role has always been there. It's just never been it's been clearly defined in other sectors like Oracle, IBM. But in the Salesforce sector, it's really come into being since obviously the certifications came through and people wanted to reach that top level of expertise and really put some credentials behind themselves to win more work and to gain more experience and to deliver value. I think that when it comes to the architect role itself, I don't think it necessarily split. I just think that people started to think about, what does a career path look like for someone who doesn't want to go into management, who has been delivering Salesforce projects, who doesn't want to be a delivery manager, who perhaps still wants to achieve some seniority and have a defined clear path as to how they reach that next step and that promotion from a technical discipline rather than a management discipline.
Right, so they still want to stay close to the technology. They don't want to sit from afar. Yeah,
and quite rightly, they want their expertise and experience to be seen and valued for what it really is, right? Everyone wants to become a leader or an authority in some way when they've got some experience. And I feel like moving into an architectural role, whatever discipline, whether you're looking at it from business or solution, Salesforce or integration, programming, etc., it's okay to have specialisms. You don't have to know everything. This is just designed to be a way to show you that. Yeah,
very cool. And previously, in other conversations we've had over the past year or so, you've mentioned something called the separation of concerns. Can you explain what that actually is?
Sure. I mean, there are official, at risk of saying something that isn't official, there are official terms. The separation of concerns is a widely recognized industry term. It's about understanding what responsibility is held by each, from a technical perspective, each system. So Salesforce, for example, we've decided strategically that Salesforce is our go-to place. It's our master for customers. So when it comes to separation of concerns, it helps to guide you in your requirements capture, because you think, okay, if I'm guided by the principle that Salesforce, anything to do with customer goes in Salesforce. So the separation of concerns here is that if I need to send a quote to a customer, it needs to come from Salesforce. However, that separation comes that I might need data from the accountancy system, or a separate quoting system, or a separate pricing system to come into Salesforce to enable me to do that. And that separation of concerns is the opportunity is managed and nurtured in Salesforce. The information that you need in order to execute on that deal has come from another area. But also from and that's how I see it from a technical perspective, and I'm sure that I'll get roasted for that, and I'm very happy to be roasted. I'm sure I've got it wrong in many ways, but when it comes to the business side, the separation of concerns, I think about who's going to be how do we focus all of this talent and have it come together so cohesively that it's a self-organizing team, and each person knows the area of the implementation that they're responsible for. Once they know that area of responsibility, the team can work together more cohesively. I think where there is conflict, where I've seen conflict in trending in the past, is where you've got two people with the same concerns arguing over the same solution. We've all been in a meeting where we've suggested that this needs to be a case, and someone else has said, no, it should be a custom object. And then you argue and argue and argue and argue. If you have that separation of concerns, everyone knows which part of the solution and the project they own. And therefore they are the design authority on that. And say, right, yes, I hear your justifications, your pros and cons, taking what my TA said about the integration and how it needs to be secured. That tells me I need a sharing rule for this, which means I need the owner of this record to be that. That's my separation of concerns. Whereas the TA is like, you need to know this, I've got to go and get it from here, I've got to secure it, I've got to scramble it, and then I've got to push it into Salesforce, then I've got to write back and say that it's been received, then I've got to tell this system. So that's the separation of concerns as an example, a working example.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. And yeah, I guess the one thing that stood out to me there was guiding principles. It sounds a bit like how an organization would manage themselves if they didn't have a hierarchy, you know, like a flat hierarchy, horizontal hierarchy. So that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So there was one architect type on the list called the transformation architect. So it was fifth on the list, but it may not have been one that people had actually heard of before. I hadn't. Because I actually believe you guys over at the Architect Club coined the term. So where did it come from, and why does it exist?
Oh, it was inspired. It's been inspired by, well, first of all, big up to all the change management consultants, right? What you do is you don't just have to get to know the ins and outs of the user experience in Salesforce, but you actively contribute to it. You train people on it. And you have to write procedural documents, which involves going to talk to different people. It involves getting decisions. It involves giving information to support that decision making. So, for example, TA decides to build a clunky. TA and SA both get together and they build this process, and it works beautifully. All the other systems are informed of what's going on at the right time, but your transformation architect takes a look at it and goes, this is going to be really tough to train. How are we going to make this easily digestible in a remote workforce over 2-hour bite-sized sessions for different learning styles? So you have to think multi-cloud as that transformation person, because it's not even just about all of that training detail. It's about what's the best way to communicate and manage the conflicts that will ultimately arise from the change that you're delivering. So our transformation architects are working on projects where they are actively defining a target operating model. So they're working with VPs and C-suites to look at, okay, how is all of the stuff that we're thinking of designing, how is it going to actually work with the backlog that the enterprise architect is building and refining? What is the model going to be around how we continue to extract that backlog from the business and refine it? What skill sets do we need in-house or externally to ensure that we can maximize the resource that we have and the budget that we have? So I see it as very much a leadership role. I see it as also the go-to point for the other architects on the team, because really the transformation is all about managing the people side. How are the people going to respond to this solution that we are going to give to them? And you might not always need a transformation architect. You know, I would see that you would need a transformation architect in situations of inertia and situations of uncertainty, where your customer needs a holding hand to assist them in managing that change, because we quite often throw that over the fence as consultants and say, you're the client, that's your responsibility. And we're saying, yes, it is your responsibility, but you don't actually have to feel like you have to scramble around and figure it out by yourself. You've got an architect here who knows how this works in the context of Salesforce, but also understands the nuances of your business and can help you manage that change and balance that best practice guidance from Salesforce and this ecosystem and the partners with all of that.
Yeah, it sounds like they get that project over the last hurdle, over the last mile, and ensure it gets there. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's great.
And we've had transformation architects reviewing statements of work and proposals and estimates as well, just to give it a sense check. Does this estimate make sense? Does this resource type make sense? Tell us what a solution architect means to you. Consultancy firm number 1, 2, 3.
Cool.
So it's about helping the client be a better client.